Coming to you from the Forge of Freedom studio in the heart of America. A podcast dedicated to preserving freedom and inspiring personal success. Freedom is born and lives through you, the individual, and it dies in the shadows of tyranny. Motivating our listeners to become well-rounded, freedom-minded people with the body of an athlete, the mind of a stoic, and the spirit of a warrior. The tree of liberty lives on through you, the Forge of Freedom. And now here's your host, Alex Ooley.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 55 of the Forge of Freedom. And today I'm joined again by attorney and firearms instructor Mike Ooley for Monday Gun Day to discuss so-called red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders. As we were talking about what we should discuss today, this came to our minds because it's something that has been pushed recently in Tennessee, but also in some other states, even states that have already adopted these so-called laws. There's a push to enforce them, and there's been that sort of initiative to enforce them even here in Indiana. Indiana, for the folks who don't know, was one of the first states, unfortunately, to adopt one of these laws. And there's been a lot of sort of misinformation around these, and we want to talk about what these are and why they are a terrible idea for liberty and for our right to keep and bear arms. So welcome again to the show, Mike, and let's get into the topic for the day.
Well, good morning.
All right.
Hey, one thing that we'll get out of the way, you already mentioned Indiana. It's not a badge of honor by any stretch of the imagination. And our law has, I guess, gotten less evil over the years. It's still evil, still horrible. I'm talking about the red flag law. But I think we were number 2 to pass one of these. After Connecticut, maybe. We passed it 2004 or 5-ish, something like that. And it's a typical example. It was a very tragic and more than unfortunate, tragic incident in which a police officer lost his life. And as horrible as that was, one of the repercussions of that is the emotional state that exists in the community and in the state, and then, of course, in the legislature to, quote, do something, end quote, takes a hold. And Indiana was susceptible to that emotional, irrational status and passed a red flag law. So, and I think that happens. You mentioned Tennessee. I think they had the mass murder by down in Tennessee,
In Nashville,
and
for which we still have no manifesto.
yeah,
by the way.
that's interesting. It'd be interesting to read that, wouldn't it? But our overlords and the government think we shouldn't see that for some reason. So this incident happens in Tennessee. What happens? Even a Republican governor in Tennessee shows some inclination to support red flag laws. I think, fortunately, the folks of Tennessee should be proud of their legislature because they've said no to the irrational concept of these red flag laws, at least in my estimation. You can tell I'm a little fired up this morning. I've had my Constitution out reading that, so I'm a little fired up about this one.
Yeah, for sure. And you mentioned the tragic incident here in Indiana. It was, like you said, an example of bad facts that create a result in bad law because of the emotional response to do something. And of course, it's to do something that would have changed nothing, would not have changed the outcome. And the same thing in Tennessee. There's this response to the mass murder at the school in Nashville. We still don't know the motive. We don't have the manifesto that the killer apparently left. Nevertheless, politicians are desperate to do something. And of course, that something would accomplish nothing to prevent these sorts of incidents.
Yeah. And it's, one thing I'll bring up this morning, I had a quote in my notes here from Justice Brandeis, who was a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. And we're lawyers. Hopefully folks out there don't hold that against us too much. But most lawyers know about this case, Olmstead versus U.S., and here's a quote that he was in that opinion. The greatest dangers to liberty lurk in insidious encroachment by men of zeal, well-meaning, but without understanding. And I think that's what, at least for the good guys out there, I think there's some good people that are advocating for red flag laws. And I think they're maybe well-meaning, but they don't understand. And of course, I think there's another group of politicians that aren't well-meaning at all. They're simply tyrants and want power. But that's, I think our objective this morning is to maybe, quote, arm people, end quote, with some facts and some information so they can kind of spread the news with other folks so they can analyze what's going on when these legislatures attempt to pass these laws.
So you've mentioned the Constitution, and we're going to certainly talk about the Constitution here today. And a lot of the problems with these red flag laws, or what are sometimes called extreme risk protection orders. But I think to start out, would you mind to say, what is a red flag law? Just generally, I mean, they're applied differently in state to state. But
well, first of all, I don't think there's a majority of states that have these quote red flag laws.
I think it's 21 right now.
Okay, so not a majority, but getting close. And I think the gun ban folks that want to ban guns and take guns away from private individuals always try to label these different, with some sort of politically correct term. They usually try to use the word safety when what they mean is they want to confiscate or violate your rights. But another flavor of this in terms of names is extreme risk protection orders. Now, the objective, if you're one of those uninformed politicians who are trying to do the right thing, the objective probably is, and I understand that they want to get firearms out of hands of individuals who are in fact dangerous. And we'll get back to the difficulty and with that, even in terms of a policy identifying people who are in fact dangerous. But that's the objective of these, is to quickly get firearms out of the hands of people who are purportedly dangerous. Now,
which is a good goal.
Yeah, good goal. The problem is always in the details.
Yeah.
And how government executes that. And I guess the first thing that I want to point out is that I'm not an expert on the law in all 50 states. Some people tell you I'm not an expert on the law in Indiana. But anyway, I can only talk about Indiana, and we have mechanisms in the law, and I think most other states do as well, probably all, have mechanisms where we can, in fact, identify dangerous people. There's due process in the law, and we get help for those people, okay? But we don't limit we don't limit the law to only take firearms away from those people. If those people are in fact dangerous, they probably shouldn't have gasoline and hatchets and knives and cars and all kinds of other dangerous instrumentalities to wreak havoc on themselves or others. So if somebody is truly dangerous and we can identify that person through due process of law, then there are mechanisms to handle that and take care of that. And they exist in all 50 states, but red flag laws, once again, there's a focus on the tool. They want to get rid of the tool, this particular tool.
And the only tool they're focused on is the gun, not knives, not other instruments that are potentially used for crime or to hurt yourself or others. So it's just this a monomaniacal really focus on the firearm. And what's distinguishable from about the red flag laws from the civil commitment procedures that you're alluding to are what a lot of people know as Baker Act laws. The Baker Act name comes from Florida. A lot of people know it by that name, but each state has their own variation of those civil commitment procedures, which require, like you said, due process, a finding by the judge, a hearing, an attorney to be appointed to the person if they can't afford one, experts to be paid for by the state, potentially if they can't afford experts, attorneys, due process, all these things afforded before your rights are taken away. Red flag laws do exactly the opposite of that. Okay, they take away the firearm, only the firearm, and then provide process later. You're not afforded an attorney. You have to, you only get a hearing after your property is taken away. The allegations can be, this is very state to state, but it may be just a spouse or an ex who is just upset at you. And of course, you know that those sorts of allegations are ripe for abuse and false information. So there's a lot of problems with these red flag laws as opposed to these civil commitment procedures.
Yeah, and the bottom line is these red flag laws, they're focused on the gun and they want to get that, they want to get that gun because, a lot of these politicians just hate guns. They don't want you to have a gun. They want, once again, they want a monopoly of violence to be with the government. That's what they want. But I think it's important, Alex, maybe we talk a little bit about, we've used this word due process. And under the Constitution, there's procedural due process and substantive due process. We won't get into that. But I think we ought to talk about just some generic notions of maybe what the founders were thinking about when they talked about in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment. They mentioned due process and how important it is. Maybe we ought to talk about some of the things that, like I said, the founders wanted us to make sure we had in place before we took life, liberty, or property from individuals in this state.
Yeah, you'd think that something you mentioned the Fifth and 14th Amendment, you'd think something that's mentioned twice in the Bill of Rights or in the Constitution we should pay attention to, right? And that due process is mentioned first in the Fifth and then again in the 14th Amendment. So what is due process?
Well, that's a long story, but we're going to mention just some generic things. Okay. One of them is you have an unbiased tribunal, and that may be, a jury of your peers, usually in this case, a red flag law, it's going to be a judge. So you want somebody that's unbiased to hear the case. It's always interesting to me. I'm going to bring this up. I'm going to see if we one of those oddballs out there. It's always been an interesting concept to me that we go to a government judge and litigate a case, and we let the government judge make a decision based upon our arguments as a private citizen versus the prosecutor, who is also a government employee. So you have government employee prosecutor, you have government employee judge deciding my fate. Most of us accept that as still an unbiased tribunal, but think about that a little bit.
Well, and I think that this is a little bit off topic, but just as an aside, I think that's why there has been a significant movement toward arbitration, because that is seen as a much more neutral and efficient forum than the government legal process.
Yeah. So I go to a state court, and we're going to have my rights decided there by a government judge who gets his salary and pension from the state, and a government prosecutor or a deputy prosecutor or whatever, and all the police officers who all get their pension and their salary from the same team.
Yeah. And that's true with respect to every process except where there is a jury trial, which was the purpose of the jury trial. The jury was meant to be a buffer between individuals and the state, but you're not entitled to a jury trial in a red flag confiscation procedure. So it's just you against the state.
Yep. And keep in mind, the judge and the prosecutor are both politicians.
Yeah.
Another thing that we want to keep in mind is the due process. One of the elements of due process is that you're supposed to get noticed a proposed action and the grounds that are being asserted against you with respect to the right they're going to deprive or the property they're going to take. And you're supposed to have the opportunity to present reasons why the state's proposed actions are not correct. You're going to have a right to present evidence, to include the right to call witnesses, subpoena witnesses. You're going to have the right to cross-examine witnesses. You may have witnesses that come in and say, hey, Mike's an oddball, or I saw Mike do this. Your attorney, another thing that you ought to have a right to is an attorney in due process. Your attorney needs a right to come in and cross-examine the person about the fact they didn't have their glasses on when they saw me doing the oddball thing. And when they don't have their glasses on, they're legally blind. And like I said, you need to have the opportunity to be represented by counsel if you want to. You need to make sure that whatever tribunal or judge is hearing your case, that there's a record made so that there's another tribunal, an appellate process where somebody can review that decision. And you've got a right to ask that tribunal, that judge, to prepare written findings of fact and conclusions of law. That is, to basically spell out exactly why he or she made the decision that they made, so that another judge or judges can look at that decision and see if it's legally correct or not under the law.
And these are all, and there are other components, but these are all examples of components of due process, right? But we know from the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment that an individual shall not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the key is that in a red flag law confiscation, the confiscation, the deprivation of property and liberty takes place before due process. The process comes after the deprivation. And no matter what flavor of a red flag law your state has adopted, they never fix that problem. They have it exactly backwards.
Yeah. In Indiana, fortunately, only police officers can exercise that right to take your firearm before due process. That sounds weird, me saying, but I'm saying that because if you can't tell, prosecutors and judges, I think, have an inclination here to support red flag laws for the most part. And I'm talking about prosecutors and judges at the state level, because if they're presented with a problem where they can deprive one or two or maybe even, make a family angry, that's not going to be a big deal in the big scheme of things in terms of them getting in the newspaper or getting reelected. But it will be a big deal, no matter how remote the possibility is, that somebody uses a firearm inappropriately. That'll reflect on the judge, the politicians, the anti-gunners will take to the media and try to, really make an example of that judge or prosecutor. So they have an incentive, in my mind, to act in a way that's contrary to the individual rights of the subject of the red flag law, just to protect their own skin, so to speak. And they're human beings, and I hate to be so negative, but they're human beings, and I think that's just the nature of what they do.
Well, and they respond to incentives, and the government has provided that perverse incentive here to respond to. And that's exactly what they're doing.
But I want to say something here positive about police officers. I believe most police officers have this intuition where they know it just seems wrong to them to take an individual's firearm. They think about it in terms of, what if that were me? So I think they have more empathy or sympathy. I'm not sure what the term is, but they seem to know. They don't make a political calculation. They seem to know that's wrong. And I think it's because, to a great extent, they're gun people. And maybe the Second Amendment means a little more to them than at least some prosecutors or politicians.
Well, and your mileage may vary on that.
That's true.
We happen to live in a jurisdiction where that is true for most police officers, but a lot of people don't live where we live.
Yeah, that's very true. I'm basing that on my personal experience of police officers I know, and that is very biased. And I think you make a great point that if you're in New York City, probably the police officers there want to take guns away from, strike that. There are probably, my guess is, a majority of police officers in some jurisdictions that would like to take guns away from everybody except the government.
But we've mentioned the Constitution a few times, and you brought your copy of the Pocket Constitution here. This one, I think you can get these for free from Hillsdale College, but I don't recall.
I think that's where this one came from.
Yeah, maybe. But the bottom line here is that the Constitution, these red flag laws, are shortcuts around the Constitution, and the Constitution is really being circumvented here in the implementation and the application of these red flag laws. Because, like we said, you're only getting due process after the deprivation of liberty and property.
Yeah. Now, we will say this in defense of the government. They generally want to give you some little bit of due process, at least after the fact, after they take your property. And that varies from state to state. And it's in my mind, the way it's designed, it's biased against the person that's having their property taken away from them. But there is some due process after they take your firearms. But as you've said many times, justice delayed is justice denied. And it puts you in a precarious situation in terms of decisions you're going to have to make to get your firearms back.
Yeah. And it just as Indiana, for example, you're entitled to a hearing within 14 days after your firearms have been seized. The problem is, number one, that's 14 days you've been deprived of your right to keep and bear arms without process. Number two, if you find an attorney to defend you, that's going to be very expensive. They may not be prepared in 14 days because they're going to need to have witnesses and evidence and potential experts to testify on your behalf. And number two, even though in Indiana the burden is on the state to prove by clear and convincing evidence that you are in fact dangerous and that the seizure was appropriate, the judges, like you said, they're thinking, feeling, acting human beings, and there are incentives for them. They're going to tend to err on the side of caution. and endorse the seizure, because even if you're not dangerous, they don't want to have blood on their hands or to be seen as having blood on their hands if someone does act inappropriately with a firearm. So even though practically the burden is on the state, or even though legally the burden is on the state to prove that you're dangerous at that initial hearing here in Indiana, the practical matter is the burden is on you to prove a negative that you're not dangerous.
Yeah. And think about that. You're proving a negative, how difficult that is.
Yeah.
Technically, you're not proving a negative, but from a practical standpoint, I think that's what's going on.
Yeah. So one thing we've talked a lot about the constitutional problem with these, but so many people say, well, yeah, I get it, the constitutional argument, but we need these. It's important to protect our safety.
Yeah. So number one, I mean, so we've talked about the Constitution, and that trumps in my mind. So, and I would always, let's assume that they could make an argument that from a policy standpoint, these would be effective. I mean, maybe there's a policy standpoint for us all to live in prisons and would be safer. Maybe, I don't know. Although those places are incredibly dangerous from what I understand. But anyway, so we could talk about the Constitution. I think that trumps. And even if they could make policy arguments that these red flag laws are worthwhile, from my standpoint, I would rather have a little bit of risky safety. I'd rather live in a free world that has some risk than in a tyrannical world that has purportedly less risk.
Yeah.
But with that aside, let's look at their policy arguments. Do they do anything? Are they effective? And I think the answer is, at best, the evidence is inconclusive and ambiguous. As a matter of fact, I would suggest to you that there's a couple studies. John Lott, we all know, or at least we know, and most of your listeners probably know, John Lott is a proponent of the Second Amendment, and he wrote, I think his seminal work was More Guns, Less Crime. So it's probably not surprising to folks that he found that red flag laws have no significant impact whatsoever on murder, suicide, number of people killed in purported mass public shootings are, depending on what your definition is, robberies, aggravated assaults, and burglaries. There was also a 2023 RAND study whose, I think most people would think they're sort of objective, maybe. They said the evidence is inconclusive about whether these things have any impact at all, have any good. And once again, even if there was evidence, I wouldn't be for them. But I think the fact of the matter is there's no evidence to support the passage and the declaration of due process rights to Americans based upon these laws.
So even if you're somebody who says, we should ignore the Constitution, that's an antiquated document, that's something from the past that doesn't apply to today. And obviously, we're clearly not saying that here.
No.
But even if you were, and you thought maybe we should trade a little bit of freedom for safety, the data, the studies don't support that.
Yeah, they don't support it. So once again, I think red flag laws lose on the Constitution. And you'll talk about that more in a little bit. Thank goodness the Second Amendment Foundation has recently filed. We'll get to that in a minute. That's some great news at the end. We'll finish with, but I don't think they meet the policy argument either. One thing I wanted to bring up as I was preparing for this, I made a note about the oddball problem. When there is a mass murder out there, there's always this 20/20 vision, and we go back and we say, oh, this person demonstrated some odd behavior. And that's usually the case. But the problem is that odd behavior that exists out there, probably today, there are tens of millions of Americans that are going to exhibit some sort of, quote, odd behavior, end quote. And I put that in parentheses, in quotes there. And even if he's read, the problem is almost none of those people who display that odd behavior are going to become mass murderers. And one of the things I think you can put in the show notes, I've got a quote here. The Department of Defense, I think in 2008, 9, 10, something like that, they did a study after a shooting at Fort Hood or Bliss. I can't remember. It was in Texas. There was a
I think it was Hood.
There was a mass shooting down there. But they did this study. And one of the things that they came up with is the point I'm trying to make here, and that is you can't predict whether somebody is really dangerous or going to be dangerous or do something dangerous. And one of the things they said in this, it's probably 100+ pages, this long study that they did, it's on page 79. I made a note. They said someone who failed the screening test, and they're talking about predicting dangerous people, someone who failed the screening test and would be determined to be a dangerous person, would have a 99.5% chance of being, quote, normal, end quote. So you see the problem here. Lots of very innocent people, law-abiding people can get caught up in these red flag laws if they're ever enforced kind of wholesale or to a great extent. Now, fortunately, at least in my experience, they're not used a great deal yet. At least in the southern part of rural Indiana, they are used, but not a great deal. But the problem is, it just brings in all these people and deprives them of rights when it's not necessary. And that's the greater evil in my mind. And I think the Department of Defense even noted it was the greater evil, the impact it would have on morale and the problems with trying to predict ahead of time. It's this issue that you know more about than I do. It's this issue of pre-crime is what it amounts to, where we punish people because of what we think they might do or because of what they're thinking. I mean, that's what's going on with these in my estimation.
Yeah. Well, and since you mentioned it, that the notion of pre-crime, I'll go ahead and talk about it a little bit. It's actually mentioned by the Second Amendment Foundation in their complaint in Maryland that they filed against the red flag confiscation procedure there. And in their complaint, and I'll link to this in the show notes, but in their complaint, and this is paragraph 5 through 7 here, I'll just read from it. It says, until the advent of red flag laws, predictive seizures and punishment were limited to dystopian science fiction, perhaps most notably in the widely acclaimed 2002 Steven Spielberg film Minority Report, in which pre-crime, a specialized police department, and its chief apprehend criminals by use of foreknowledge provided by 3 unquestioned and purportedly infallible psychics called precogs. And they go on further down in the complaint, and they say one of the characters in the show, and then much like the sponsor of the red flag bill in Maryland, admitted that it's the respondents' possible actions that we are worried about. And that's this sort of creepy pre-crime that's going on with these red flag laws. Oh. And I'll just read one more.
I saw one that creepy is an understatement. I see there that this is a great, you're going to link this. People ought to read this. But I noticed paragraph 7 says the RFL red flag law turns the Maryland court system into a modern day star chamber by authorizing the infliction of arbitrary seizures and punishment on less than probable cause in order to stop possible conduct, period. Yeah. That's what's scary about these. And you know what else is scary? The propaganda machine of the government and the media has resulted in at least some polls, and I understand it depends on how you answer the question, but a lot of Americans actually think these red flag laws are good ideas. As a matter of fact, the NRA came out at one point in time in the past saying, hey, they support these as long as they meet the criteria. Now, I will tell you the criteria they set out was pretty stringent, and probably no red flag law in the country would meet those criteria. But this is something, that's why you see a Republican politician in Tennessee come out before this, because the media has done a good job propagandizing this subject and getting people to go, oh, yeah, sign me up. We can give away some rights for some purported safety. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
So I'll link to this complaint. We encourage you to read the complaint. It's Willie or Wiley, I'm not sure how you say his first name, in the Second Amendment Foundation versus Anthony G. Brown in his official capacity as Attorney General of Maryland. And it's their complaint in the United States District Court for the District of Maryland Northern Division. So I'll link to that. But you're right. The media does such a good job at propagandizing this issue. And I'll link to this. You mentioned John Lott earlier. He talks about the way that these polls are done and how the questions are asked, and how sort of this illusion too of public support for these is generated, because often if people know how these actually work, they're as creeped out by it as we are, and as concerned about the possibility of abuse and the likelihood of abuse of this sort of process.
Yep.
So,
yeah, I mean, and if we can get folks educated to understand this, those politicians who are simply worried about getting reelected and their salary and their pension for the most part, most of them, at least some of them, will go the other way on these things. And it brings up another thing before you're probably getting ready to finish up. The Second Amendment Foundation, everybody read that complaint. I think it'll educate you on red flag laws. And keep in mind one thing, they come in lots of different flavors. Indiana's will be a lot different than Florida's, for instance, or whatever. But support these organizations. The Second Amendment, I'm a member of the Second Amendment Foundation. They're doing great work. GOA, Gun Owners of America, they're out in the forefront, challenging a lot of these activities of where the government's trying to take your rights away. I'm also a member of Firearms Policy Coalition. They're a little, for some people, they're a little
abrasive, maybe,
or bolsterous, or abrasive, and I like that. And I give something to them every month. So please support these folks, whoever it is, all of them, so that they can continue this work, because it's important.
Yeah, and I'll just mention real quickly here, the Second Amendment Foundation started an initiative recently called Capture the Flag, and it's an effort to stem the tide and scale back these red flag laws around the country, because, and I'll link to this article from Ammoland in the show notes as well, but the article, further down in the article, quotes Alan Gottlieb, who was one of the founding members, and he's the executive vice president of the Second Amendment Foundation. He says, "We have already taken legal action against officials in Maryland for what is an egregious abuse of the law against a citizen in Dorchester County. But all of these laws should raise alarms because they prioritize," and this is the key point, "they prioritize citizen disarmament ahead of due process, and that can easily lead to deprivation of rights under the color of law." And that's exactly what we've been talking about here today, is that it prioritizes safety over freedom. And in fact, there is no evidence to show that they do anything to enhance safety, but they enhance safety over freedom. And I don't have the quote at my fingertips, but there's a popular quote about those who would trade freedom for a little bit of safety deserve neither.
Yeah, I think one of the founders that's attributed to. Yeah.
So, and there are various quotes and variations of that that support that same notion, and that's exactly what's going on with these red flag laws.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'll be quiet in a minute, but you and I just spent some time in Europe, and we have some good friends that are in, for instance, Europe, and their attitude towards guns is much different than ours, but you see in their public policies, and they're very smart people, some of them are anyway, but you see this notion where they're willing to give away freedom. Freedom's not that, they're anxious, they're scared, they're willing to give away their freedom for these propagandized notions supported by propaganda that they'll somehow be a little safer if they give that freedom to the government.
Yeah. I think everybody watching the show knows where I fall on this issue. I even if it would enhance safety a little bit, I wouldn't support it because I prefer, I think it was Thomas Jefferson, the tempestuous sea of liberty over the tyrannical security state security that's provided by the government, or the illusion of security that's provided by the government more accurately, I think. So anyway, any other thoughts, Mike, before we close? I hope that people learned a little bit about red flag laws and the problems associated with them. Of course, there are some problems that we didn't even touch on, but I think we covered the highlights. Yeah,
just keep in mind, this seems to be one of the areas that even Republicans are willing to accede ground, and don't let them do it because they're doing it for the wrong reasons. Like I said, at one point, the NRA was like, oh, okay, well, red flag laws might be okay under certain conditions. Donald Trump at one point, I think, supported red flag laws. Yeah. I think he changed course, probably would say he doesn't support them now. But just keep that in mind. Read the Second Amendment Foundation complaint and be on your guard about this stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's important here to point out, too, the importance of staying engaged at the state level, because even if the federal government decides that they want to adopt some sort of national red flag law, they won't be able to implement it or enforce it without the engagement of state officials to help them enforce it. So make sure you stay engaged at the state level. Make sure that your state, if they haven't already, doesn't adopt one of these. And if they have, like in Indiana, stay engaged to try to scale it back or to eliminate it completely, because the states are really the last vestige of freedom, because the federal government, I think, is not a lost cause, but it's not where it's not the entity we should look to protect our freedom.
Absolutely not. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So anyway, another thing, last thing I'll mention, I think Oklahoma, there's been a movement by localities. For instance, in Indiana, Indianapolis, the mayor up there has they've passed some ordinances or whatever. They're very anti-Second Amendment. They're not effective now because of preemption laws in Indiana. But I think Oklahoma even passed a statute that says localities can't pass these sort of red flag laws. So folks, if you're in a state that doesn't have a red flag law, be on the lookout for your locality, your city, your county, whatever, that may try to implement something like this.
Yeah. All right, Mike. Well, thanks again for joining the show. One thing I didn't mention, I will link to that DOD report that you referenced as well. So if people are interested in that, they can check that out in the show notes. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Forge of Freedom. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss a future episode. For more information or to connect with Alex, you can go to forgeoffreedom.com or follow him on Twitter at Forge of Freedom. Until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.